This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Police and Crime Committee meeting. This morning we're holding our monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. Please can everyone make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent to avoid any unnecessary interruptions. And can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if there are any apologies?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly members Ahmad, Bailey and Duval.
Thank you very much. And then can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Thank you. Can we note the outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent and received? Thank you. And can we note the response received from the Minister for Crime, Policing and Fire to the committee's letter regarding the report of Sir Thomas Windsor? And can we also note the responses received from the London Ambulance Service and the London Fire Brigade to the committee's report, Counter-Terrorism and Radicalisation? Thank you. So we now move on to our main item of business, and I'd like to welcome our guests. We have Sophie Linden, who is Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. Louisa Rolfe, OBE, Assistant Commissioner for Frontline Policing for the Metropolitan Police Service, welcome. And Adi Adelakan, who is Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Operations with the Metropolitan Police Service, also very welcome. Thank you, everyone. We're going to start our questioning looking at one of the biggest policing events that has of recent years, possibly the biggest ever, which is the policing of the Coronation. And of course, as a committee, we give our congratulations to the police for a safe and well-run event. We do also have some questions about the policing of the Coronation. So I'd like to just start with the Deputy Mayor, Sophie Linden, by asking if you believe that the Met policed the coronation of His Majesty the King and Her Majesty Queen Consort in a proportionate manner in line with relevant legislation, and if you could also say why you think that.
Thank you very much. I think we should straight away acknowledge that it's, the coronation it was just such a huge event for the Metropolitan Police to police, to keep safe, to make sure it ran smoothly. The amount of planning and really attention to detail that it took, and to congratulate the Metropolitan Police for actually on the day, and as I'm sure we all watched, a fabulous coronation that in the main were passed off incredibly smoothly. I know, and you know, that we had concerns over a small number of arrests that took place on the day. The Mayor did write to the Commissioner about those arrests, seeking answers to questions around the use of legislation, the arrest of the Night Stars who were working in Westminster, and we have had a response from the Commissioner around that. So in relation to those particular issues around the arrest, we were concerned about that, and I know that the Metropolitan Police are undertaking a review of the overall operation of the police on that day, which will also include those arrests, and we're looking forward to the outcome of that review and being able to assess and assure ourselves around that review. And the Mayor has also asked that the high-level conclusions of that review are made public, because it's really important in terms of transparency and accountability, that where there is that public interest concern, that there is the public can see what the review has come up with, and if lessons need to be learned, they are learned. I'm very keen to stress that is the high-level conclusions. We're not asking for the whole report to be published, the whole review to be published, because there will be operational matters in that wouldn't be appropriate to be published. So we absolutely accept that, but we would like to see the high-level conclusions published so that the public can see that there has been a review, and that if lessons are to be learnt, they are being learnt.
Thank you. Can you just give us a time scale on that? Have you been given a time scale?
So I'm sure my colleagues here will be much better at answering that, but my understanding is that review is taking place this month. I don't know how long it will take to reach conclusions and for there to be a high-level conclusions that are appropriate for public consumption.
Assistant Commissioner, are you able to give any more on the timing of that?
I'm afraid I don't have any more information at this time. As you'll appreciate, it will be a multi-agency review, and whilst we'll be looking in detail at the policing operation, the policing was one part of ensuring an effective celebratory event. Mm-hmm. So we will be working with others and doing that, of course, as soon as possible.
Now, I have been talking with quite a few of the people who were arrested on the Coronation Day. I've been have spoken with one of the Night Stars, and learned about what their job is. They hand out bottles of water mainly and give people directions to get to the bus, to catch a night bus home. They do give out bottles of water. They sometimes give out slippers and vomit bags to people. They do carry rape alarms in their anti-spiking kits that they've been given relatively recently to carry, but actually have never given out one of those anti-spiking kits, so they've never actually given out a rape alarm to anyone. So I think the question that I think many people have is there was an idea about a growing intelligence picture, which kind of caused there to be concern about, I understand, paint, rape alarms and incursion onto the route. And is this this growing, a growing intelligence picture isn't necessarily actual evidence, and I just wonder what double checking was done of this growing intelligence picture to back up the actions that were taken.
Thank you, Chair. And I think probably important to give a little bit of context, and then I may ask my colleague, DAC Delican, to help in terms of the detailed answers you're seeking. But this was the largest security operation the Metropolitan Police has ever led, including the deployment of 11,500 officers and staff and volunteers from across the Met. Over 1,200 colleagues who joined us from the UK and overseas, 6,500 military ceremonial troops and over 160 horses, working with almost 9,000 stewards. So a vast operation over a large part of central London. And you'll appreciate the world's eyes were on us, and therefore it would have attracted those who may have sought an opportunity to cause disruption. But also the vast majority of people we know were coming to celebrate the coronation and to have a wonderful time. And we took our role in ensuring their safety and security, in allowing the event to go ahead, and also, we take our role to facilitate peaceful protest as appropriate very seriously as well. In addition to that central event, there were over 1,800 local community events taking place, whilst we ensured that we were still able to provide policing services across London, responding to 999 calls, and we're really grateful for the support we had from volunteers and all of our officers across the whole of the Met in ensuring, and the staff as well, who ensured a safe event. We did take, over those 3 days of the coronation, around 24,000 emergency calls, with officers and specials deployed to many of them. So a large event. The operation was many months in the planning, and we were working closely with others. And I think what I would say about an intelligence picture, of course, intelligence is not evidence, but the way that we work and we operate is that we have to respond swiftly to a developing intelligence picture, and it may not always be feasible or practical to ensure evidence before an arrest is made. That, under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, an arrest is made on the basis of reasonable grounds. Now, of course, that might depend on the nature of the offence that's suspected and whether it is an arrestable offence or an offence for which people must be found committing. But to, and of course we will then always act swiftly to ensure that we have, the veracity of that intelligence and that information when we make steps. So, and in addition to that operation that ensured the safety and security of the members of the public coming to see a wonderful celebratory event, there were 312 of the world's leaders and dignitaries in the area being protected by 800 close protection officers. There were no practical alternative processional routes within central London. It's not that we could have, taken contingencies with others and quickly diverted a ceremonial route. We were quite limited, and therefore our actions would have been according to the options available to us to balance the rights of individuals seeking to protest with the rights of the vast majority who came to watch the coronation, and predominantly for us to ensure the safety and the security of the event. But Adi, are you able to assist on the specific questions?
I can. I would go. I'll start by saying that the intelligence was significant enough and worried us enough that senior sort of colleagues were briefed late on the Friday night into the Saturday, and I think I suggest that senior political colleagues were briefed on the detail of some of the details of the intelligence, just to show the significance. I would go as far as to say that we were deeply concerned that for people's safety and security within the coronation procession route as well. And hence, we had a command team on that night. So you talk about what was there to check and make sure we check. We had a gold commander who was very senior level, at my level, who was in the control room. We had a silver commander who was a very senior level public order commander in the control room, checking and double checking. We had our intelligence teams working significantly through the night just to make sure that we could keep everyone safe and secure. And if you put that against the backdrop of our late Queen's Platinum Jubilee, where 3 people managed to get onto the procession route, and with a total of 12 tried, and really this was a real and credible concern for us that caused us to act in the manner that we acted to make sure that people were safe and secure.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the Night Stars were trying to make it clear who they were, make it clear that they were volunteering on a scheme that was funded by the Home Office and in collaboration with the Metropolitan Police and Westminster Council. They're volunteers helping people out on a night out. Are you concerned that those 3 people spent the night in a custody suite in a prison cell?
Now, of course, we want to understand the detail of what happened, and those individual arrests and the circumstances surrounding them will be fully explored in our debrief process. And we will, if we've got things wrong, we will apologise to individuals affected, and we'll work through that. But also, officers, we trust our officers to make decisions on the ground, often with the circumstances they face and on the basis of information and intelligence available to them. And they will make inquiries to, validate the information they hold, but also they will sometimes need to make very fast-time decisions to ensure that they're, carrying out their duties to ensure the safety and security of an event. Now, that might mean that has implications for individuals, but we will work through all of that. And of course, people who carry out volunteering roles and support us in the security and safety of London are really important to us in the Met. And if there is more for us to learn from those events, then of course we want to learn. But of course, we want to support our officers who've made difficult decisions in challenging circumstances on the basis of credible information and intelligence that suggested a threat.
Mm-hmm. I now want to move on to a group of people who were arrested for wearing T-shirts and having flags while standing on the pavement on the Mall. I spoke yesterday with a couple of academics who were amongst that group of arrested people. They described that they wanted to take part in a legal protest, that they thought the King would be sympathetic to raising the alarm about the climate crisis. They were on, as I say, on the pavement, on the Mall. They were wearing T-shirts and they had small flags with them. They were under the impression that that came within the framework of legal protest. They found themselves suddenly surrounded by TSG officers, and they were put into handcuffs. And once they'd been put into handcuffs and led to the edge of the crowd, they were read their rights. They were searched, and it was found they were wearing Just Stop Oil T-shirts underneath their coats and hoodies and whatever. And the police said they had intelligence that they had paint, rape alarms and lock-on devices, but they didn't have any of those things. None of those things were found on that group of 12, 13 people who were arrested. Now, they were initially arrested for prevention of breach of the King's peace. They were then later rearrested on conspiracy to obstruct the public highway, and then even later when they got to the police station, they were rearrested for conspiracy to cause a public nuisance, which is a rather more serious charge. Do you have anything to say about the way that what they were being arrested for kept changing? I mean, it's just in terms of the confidence of Londoners that their rights to protest legally are being upheld. It is really important that we understand, you know, what was happening there.
Thank you, Chair. We were very clear in policing the operation that we must consider balancing people's human rights with the heightened security context they were facing, the numbers of public attending this occasion, and therefore, our threshold and tolerance for disruption might have been lower than if we were dealing with other events. But we were very clear that we were not banning protest, and in fact there were a significant number of people involved in protest, peaceful protest throughout the Coronation event. At one point, a large group of Not My King supporters held a large and noisy protest in Trafalgar Square, with satellite groups at other locations, around 400 people involved in that. It was only when that increased to around 900 people marching around the footprint that it began to cause public safety issues, and we needed to intervene. In terms of the information available to officers, because these were fast-moving events, and you'll be aware that we've seen in the past people on the Mall wanting to get into the route, and when you're talking about 650 military horses that they're not like police horses that are trained to have petrol bombs thrown at them, people screaming around them, and lots of noise and disorder. They are military horses that might be trained and exercised differently, and you might have seen the footage of just one of those horses startled in Parliament Square, and the catastrophic impact of people injured as a result of that. Now, that wasn't anything to do with protest, but of course we were very conscious of public safety and the safety of anyone, even anyone who might have themselves tried to get onto the Mall or into the event. And the information available to officers as they police this fast-moving, dynamic situation will have changed. And therefore that might have changed the grounds for arrest and the reasonable cause they had to take action. So I can't answer for those specific events. Chair, you've had the benefit of speaking to individuals.
Of course.
You will have heard their account of what's happened. We will, of course, look at the broad picture as much as we can in our review, and we'll be speaking to officers. We'll look at things like body-worn video, and we'll look to understand and seek to understand fully what's happened in all of those events. But
yes, I mean, I think the review of your body-worn video will be really important. I mean, these were people who were wearing T-shirts with the slogan on. They were carrying small flags, but they were standing on the pavement, and they were pulled out and arrested, and that's a fairly scary situation to have happened, and it makes Londoners that we have a proud history of protest in London. People have protested about all sorts of things. It's almost like going out for a big long Sunday walk in the countryside, doing a march through London on a big organised protest. But it is, if people are being arrested because they've got a T-shirt on, it's and they're carrying a small flag, that has a pretty chilling kind of weight on Londoners who might want to protest.
As I said earlier, Chair, there were many hundreds of people involved in peaceful protests throughout the Coronation events itself who were not arrested. The arrests were a very small number in comparison with the tens of thousands of Londoners who came along to enjoy the celebratory event, and officers will have been balancing the information and intelligence available to them, their very clear considerations of safety of the general public and security of a very significant event, with the information available and the steps taken to make arrests. And of course we'll review each of those individual arrests.
Well, I hope you do, because these people, there was no Just Stop Oil T-shirt on display when they were picked out, so they were clearly picked out for some reason. These are people who had, one of the people I spoke to yesterday had never been arrested before, had partaken in protest, but it's, you start wondering, is it that if you have protested about climate change, that you are more likely to get picked out by the police and arrested? That starts to have really worrying implications. And there was one other thing that I was told yesterday about the arrest, which will come out in the body-worn footage, I'm sure. One of the people arrested had her bank card, and the officer asked what her name was. She said, "I'll give you my name in the custody suite." And they said, "If you don't give me your name, you're going to be arrested for handling stolen items." And that is, again, is a really worrying way of interacting. Now, of course, they could have told me something that didn't happen, but they know that there will be body worn of that interaction. And it is really worrying that that kind of intimidation appears to have been used.
Chair, as I've said, our officers all expect to justify their actions, particularly when, the process of arrest and detention is subject to the law, but also independent review and regular review. So, of course, we will look into those matters. And I think, as I've said, you mentioned climate protesters. I think if you just watch the news this week, you'll see that we take robust but proportionate action when it comes to disruption across London. But we make very few arrests, and those arrests are proportionate to the level of disruption to the wider public in London. So we work incredibly hard to balance people's rights. We don't focus on particular groups, and we try to be incredibly equitable in our use of the legislation available to us, but also to balance the rights of the public. And in the Coronation, we had the additional complexity of security, a fast-moving event, and real concerns about the safety and security of that event and the public attending. But I don't know if my colleague wants to add more around those particular issues.
Yeah, Chair, if I may, it may interest the panel to know that there is still a significant investigation ongoing following the number of arrests that were made during the Coronation. I think 64 in total, of which 42 people are still on bail, to which there is an investigation going on. So we're limited in what we can say at this particular point in time. And coupled with that also, there are some civil actions being taken against us, as well as the threat of possible judicial review. So we will still have to explain ourselves. And once we come to the conclusion of all of those, I suppose we probably might be able to say a little bit more. I take the point that you raise around people being arrested for just wearing T-shirts. I wish to reassure the panel that that is not the case. We talked about the existence of credible intelligence that caused us significant concern around the safety and security of those that may well be coming to the Coronation and within the Coronation footprint itself. It frustrates me so slightly that I couldn't share all of that intelligence with you, but we took. What I want to reassure you is that we we took and we will continue to take proportionate action that is bound within the legal framework that allows us to do those things. And as my Assistant Commissioner said, that in the course of time, if we find that there are some flaws in that, then we will come out and say so. Embedded within policing is a real tradition of briefing, debriefing and reviewing and learning lessons. And that process has already started. It started the night after the coronation. I believe it's on the 12th or the 14th, and I get my dates right for you. There was a partnership debrief that will take place, and there will be subsequent other internal debriefs. When you combine all of those together, we will take some learning from that. I've yet to see a perfect operation. There is always something to learn, and I'm sure there are some things that we learn. But now is not the right time to start to go into those, if that is okay.
Okay, so the high level reporting of that review, those lessons and learnings will
come in due course.
You will come out in due course.
Excellent.
Thank you. I have one more question before I move on to Assembly Member Devonish, which is just about the use of live facial recognition at the coronation. I understand there was a watch list of 10,000 people used at the coronation, and I just wonder that 10,000 people. There, you are clear that there was a reason that they could be present at the coronation for all 10,000 of them. It seems a very big watch list. The watch lists in the past have been a few hundred, and apart from the sort of recent deployments in Camden and Islington, where you had a watch list of around 10,000 as well. So, yes, can you just talk a little bit about the thinking behind that?
Thank you, Chair. I think we may need to come back to you with a little more detail on this. So my understanding is that the watch list was formed from those whose attendance would raise public protection concerns. Now, that would generally be those who might present a threat to public safety, people who might be wanted for very serious offences of violence or sexual offences, or that we might have concerns regarding the threat that they present to the wider public. But I don't have available to me the criteria that we used for that watch list. So I think to be accurate for the committee, I will take that away and respond in writing if I may.
That would be very much appreciated. Thank you. So I'm going to bring in Assembly Member Devonish, and just so members know, I've then got Assembly Member Desai, Assembly Member Pidgeon, Assembly Member Hall, and then Assembly Member Prince on my list.
Thank you. Can I start by thanking the police for, I thought, was one of the best periods in policing I've seen as the Westminster Assembly member. I had record numbers of people saying to me what a great job you did, personal engagement with officers on the street. I didn't have any complaints whatsoever, and I thank you for the service of the Met and all your support partners in the community, so thank you very much. My question is to do with the new Public Order Act of 2023. Do you welcome the provisions of that Act, and specifically why? And can I start with the Deputy Mayor and then move on to the police, please?
Thanks a lot. I mean, as an Act, it's obviously been incredibly controversial. Some of the provisions in the Act we do welcome, such as buffer zones outside abortion clinics or protection for journalists who are covering protests, but others we don't welcome and have been also subject to quite a lot of public debate, such as going equipped to lock on, for example, and that being a possible grey area, as a bike lock can be equipped to lock on or equipped to attach your bike to a railing. So no, not all the provisions in the Public Order Act are welcome. I think it should be kept under significant review. I think there should be a review by HMIC FRS into the use of the Public Order Act, not just in London but nationally. Obviously, a lot of the protests do take place in London, but there are protests elsewhere. I don't know how often the Public Order Act has been used elsewhere. In terms of my role and MOPAC's role in looking at the Public Order Act and how it is being used in London, my understanding is it's only been used once, and that was during the coronation. It is something we have asked the Met to keep us regularly updated and informed as to the use of the Public Order Act, so we can get a good view of how it is being used and where it is being used. But I think actually this is a national issue that HMRC FRS should look at. They've done, as you know, inspections on the policing of protests. I think they should be looking at this in particular as well.
Thank you. Assistant Commissioner?
Thank you for your question. I think we would also support the measures that the Deputy Mayor supports, but additionally, we know from our experience that this Act does address some of the issues that we found tricky in the past. So, for example, the issuing of advanced conditions and lowering the threshold. It's still a very senior role, a commander who would be involved in the planning of that event and appropriately briefed, but that would certainly be a practical consideration for us in terms of conditions on assemblies and processions. Some clarity regarding the definition of serious disruption can be useful for us. The offence of locking on, and whilst I think I would absolutely agree with the Deputy Mayor that the scrutiny of the way that new legislation is used, and that the Public Order Act is legislation that often there's a lot of case law as well that develops around our use of these powers that will, I'm sure, over time influence the way that we operate, because as my colleague has said, we have a really good regime of debriefing and learning from the way that we police protests. But I'm sure you'll all recall the huge disruption in London through 2019 around locking on, and when people use things like a bike lock to affix themselves to street furniture, having watched our officers remove somebody, and the investment in equipment we must buy, both safety equipment to protect people, the fact that we'll place a cushion under their bottom whilst putting a visor on them and putting on all kinds of protective equipment to protect them, whilst having to use an angle grinder to remove them, taking many hours whilst motorists, ambulances, food deliveries, businesses and the public across London are disrupted. Actually, if there are things we can do and legislation we can use proportionately to address that serious disruption, then we are supportive. But of course, that we must balance people's rights. And so, yes, there are measures in here that we welcome, but my colleague has much more expertise in this, and I'm sure we'll have something to say.
Thank you. Deputy Assistant, do you want to say anything?
Yes, if I may. So we welcome the clarity that it brings to parts of the Public Order Act that have significantly sort of challenged us. So what the 2023 Public Order Act gives us is some clarity on some of the issues that have been challenging. So lock-on is one of those things, and it can be quite disruptive. I think what I want to emphasise is that this does not take away the requirement for us as a service to balance the rights of those that seek to protest against the rights of others. It does not take that away, so we will continue to do that. It doesn't take away, and we will emphasise that the necessity for us to be proportional in the way that we apply this. So that's doesn't take that away either. So what it really does for us is just provide some clarity, but actually in terms of proportionality, necessity, those are still very much considerations, but once we're applying those and are still very much open to scrutiny as well.
Thank you. And going back briefly just to the coronation, when you were policing the coronation, this is to the police obviously, when you were policing the coronation, did you have a robust understanding of these new powers in the Act? And do you believe they were always used appropriately, please?
Thank you for your question. We put a lot of effort in because, of course, you're aware, as we are, of the timeline around the release of this new legislation. So we had a very clear strategy in terms of our approach around the safety and security of the event and the proportionate use of legislation to balance people's rights. And as my colleague has said, respecting the freedom of peaceful assembly and the right to protest in a peaceful way being fully supported by us. But, and we were very clear in our briefing and the time that we took to ensure that from those in charge of the operation to those on the ground having, updated information about changes in legislation and the practical application of that legislation. As much as we knew at that stage, the College of Policing worked very hard to have authorised professional practice ready and guidance that we could share with officers on the ground. So we moved very quickly to ensure that officers were briefed, both as those who are going to be on the ground, but also the leaders in charge of the operation. In terms of the proportionate use of that legislation, as we've said, we're still working through the learning and the debrief, and as my colleague has said, some of those arrests may be subject to complaint, some of those cases are still subject to live criminal proceedings, so it would be inappropriate for me to comment on individual cases.
Thank you. And my final question, in turns back to the Act again, what plans does the Met have to ensure all relevant officers are fully trained in the Public Order Act, and what are the timescales for that, please?
Yes, I think training has already started, so I can personally tell you that following the Act coming into place, and part of it, because it's still ongoing. I think we're expecting some more parts of the Act to come into force in July. But we've already started to update and train our officers. So first and foremost, the senior commanders, the public order, public safety officers have already received a briefing aided by the College of Policing's clarification on the Act, and that took place before the coronation. The ongoing CPD days where we will brief officers, and for the officers who are public order trained, when they go for the public order refresher, they will get training. What we're also doing is bespoke training for officers within a Westminster area who deal with protests rather significantly on a day-to-day basis, and also our colleagues from the parliamentary and diplomatic protection units also will get specific training, but in due course. Yet again, like briefing, debriefing and reviewing, training our officers is embedded into, so we have a training cycle where officers will receive training, and we'll embed this as a significant part of that as well. So it's an ongoing process. But whilst we don't stop at the point where we think everybody's been trained, every time they come for their CPDs, we will pick out things that need refreshing, and most certainly this will be one of them, because it's a very new bit of legislation, and one we think we probably need to repeat a few times before we absolutely certain that everyone's got it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to move to Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to the panel. If I can start off with you, Assistant Commissioner Rolfe. Did the Met employ Clause 11 of the new Act to police the coronation? Clause 11 gives uniformed officers the power to stop anyone within a specific geography without need to have reasonable grounds. So did you use Clause 11 at all?
Did you use?
Oh,
I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that question. We'll need to come back to you unless you have an answer to that.
I'm afraid I don't have the answer to the question.
If you can come back to us. And this is both to you, SC Rolfe, and to the Deputy Mayor. Do you think extending Section 60 style stop and search powers to protest-related offences rather than to deal with violence is proportionate?
I think my view on that in terms of stop and search, so of course we focus on using stop and search, and my colleague here who leads for us on stop and search will, I'm sure, have more to say. Our challenge with protest often, particularly, we find that things can happen quickly. Disruption can be so significant that it might pull officers away from dealing with violence. And we're working very hard to focus our work in London's communities, with the communities most affected by crime. And just, recent events, the Just Stop Oil protests, we know that where many hundreds, if not thousands of officers are pulled away from that local policing effort and activity with communities to deal with significant disruption in central London. And if we can use powers appropriately and proportionately to mitigate that impact before it grows and becomes disproportionate, then those powers are useful to us, yes.
Your views, Deputy Mayor?
I think you're putting Assistant Commissioner in a bit of a difficult position, because this is an act that's been passed by Parliament. So I do genuinely think that, because the use of those powers has to be proportionate, of course, but you're asking her a view of powers that have been passed by Parliament.
Your view,
my view is that I don't think it is proportionate. It's one of those clauses that I think was not necessary, and one of the clauses that we have opposed, and the Mayor has opposed, and we have been opposing. So that's my view. I think it can be very difficult, can't it? It's suspicionless stop and search. We know that the issues around stop and search, and particularly around some disproportionality within it. So my view is that it's one of those clauses that we opposed in terms of the passage of the Public Order Act 2023.
I should say, Chair, that very often police officers do give their opinion on what they think of particular bits of legislation. So, let's not pick and choose, right? And my final question, Chair, let's go back to the beginning. So you acted, Assistant Commissioner Rolfe, on the basis of intelligence received, a fast-moving situation, totally understandable. And now, I don't expect you at all to go into the specifics of the intelligence that you are getting. But I think I am entitled to ask you, because that formed the basis of everything you did on the day. How detailed was it? How specific? For instance, did you get information that individual A is planning to do A, B, C, D, or whatever? Because, as I said, I don't expect you to go to specifics, obviously, right? But I think I'm also entitled to ask you, what was the nature of the intelligence? How detailed was it? Because, as I said, that formed the basis to the 64 arrests.
So this is very difficult to answer whilst there are ongoing criminal investigations are limiting my response.
And there's civil actions as well.
Yes. So I don't think there's much more I can add unless my colleague wants to add more to that. But I don't think we can answer your question here appropriately whilst there are ongoing criminal proceedings to go into the detail.
It was detailed enough, but it was detailed enough for you to be worried.
Yes, we were very concerned. Yes.
Are you done? Thank you, Assembly Member Desai. And thank you, Deputy Mayor, for making that point about the political nature of the question, because I wouldn't want Assistant Commissioner to be asked a question that was inappropriately political.
I'll ask what I want to ask.
Of course you will, Umesh, of course. So can I now bring in Assembly Member Pigeon?
I have one question. I've been listening very carefully to what you say, Assistant Commissioner, and you use the phrase, the threshold and tolerance for disruption was lower than for other events. So isn't the reality you decided to be very cautious and in some ways over-arrest and then answer questions later, rather than be cautious but risk chaotic scenes, serious disruption and damaging images around the world? Wasn't that really the decision the Met made, rightly or wrongly?
Our considerations, my view, were based on safety and security of the event, and our lower thresholds were because of the significance of those risks to safety and security. The number of military personnel, military horses, the number of protected individuals, the huge numbers of members of the public. Those are the issues that will have affected our tolerance, not the fact that, of course, the eyes of the world were on us and it was a matter of significance, but this was about safety and security of the event, which was our role there, and ensuring that our officers had information to support them in carrying out their role. And I think I was really clear in saying that, we saw a huge number of people able to peacefully protest around the footprint of the event.
Yeah. But it was a cautious approach because of the nature of the event. And so in other events in the future, you may not arrest people in the same way because it's the nature of the event that led you to be, in my view, very cautious, rightly so probably in this case, rather than, allow potential...
It was the nature of the risk that was presented based on the intelligence that we received. That formed the basis of our decision making. When you take the context of the number of people that are going to be hundreds of thousands of people within the footprint, you take the intelligence and very credible intelligence. So this was about mitigating the risk and keeping people safe and secure. Really, and every event has to be taken within its context, and every aspect within that event has to be taken within its context. And just to reassure you that all of those fast time decisions will be put through the lens of what have we got here in terms of information, what are the options that we have today, and are they legal? Are they proportionate? And are they actually necessary? Or do we have other options that are less intrusive? And I can assure you, we went through that cycle several times over in every minutiae in order to reach the conclusions and the arrests that we made. Yeah. So this was around mitigating risk, nothing other than that, and making sure that we kept people safe and secure.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Pidgeons, and now Assemblymember Hall.
Thank you, and I'd like to echo my the comments of my colleague. It was an incredible operation. The vast majority of Londoners and others thought you did an extremely good job, and we're all very, very grateful to you. AC Rolfe, do you think the officers had the right powers to police the event? Is there anything else? Are there any other powers that you wish that you could have to police an event like that?
I think I'm at risk of being drawn into political debate again.
I think Assemblymember Hall, you may be. It's genuinely not meant as political. Is there anything else that would really assist the police in doing? It's genuinely not political. We should help the police to help us, quite frankly. And if you'd rather not answer, I'd like to hear privately, because only because, listen, politics shouldn't come into this. This is policing. This is what affects all of us. They've made a damn good job of what they did at the Coronation, and I am merely saying, is there anything else that they could use that would make it that much more helpful? If you think it's political, it's genuinely not meant to be, but if you think it is, then don't answer, because it's certainly not meant to be political.
No, and I think I know where you're coming from, and my sense on this is that there'll be rich learning from this event, much of which will be based on the learning we always have when we work in partnership with others. And as you said, we're very proud of our role in ensuring the safety and the security of the event. We worked really closely with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, with the stewarding companies, with local authorities across London. An awful lot of learning will come from our communication with others, the work that we did in preparation. I don't expect that what we'll come up with is a sense of us requiring more powers to enable us to have conducted a safe operation. That is my sense at the moment, but the learning and the debrief may reveal more, but I don't think we will come up saying that we require more powers to deliver a safe and secure operation.
Thank you for the answer. Thank you. Deputy Mayor, to what extent were you and the Mayor briefed on the Met's plans for the event, and were you told about the significant concerns that there were the night before?
So yes, I mean, obviously the coronation was long in the planning, so there's been various bilaterals where it was discussed in terms of the planning. The Mayor was also briefed at a regular bilateral meeting right before the coronation, and he was briefed additionally on Friday night because of the emerging intelligence picture around threats to disrupt the coronation. I'm not going to go into further details around that because of the operational aspects of it. So yes, we were, myself and the Mayor were being briefed.
Okay, and did you have any concerns about the plans that were being put in place?
In terms of the strategic plans and the way in which the Metropolitan Police and partners were planning, no, not any concerns around the strategic plans. Obviously, the use of powers and what happens on the day is, as the Assistant Commissioner has said today, is around operational policing and operational decisions made by individual officers, which are not we're not briefed on those, obviously, because they have not yet happened. It's the strategic plans that we were being briefed on, and the Mayor was briefed in terms of the intelligence picture.
Okay, so do you think that the Met should have done anything differently?
I think we're yet to find that out, aren't we, because of the review that's happening, the operational review that's happening. I need and the Mayor needs to see the high-level the conclusions of that and the review itself. We're yet to find that out because they, in terms of those specific arrests that we've talked about today and discussed today, as to whether they were proportionate and appropriate, and we're yet to find that out. So when we have more evidence, I'll be able to answer that question properly.
Okay.
But I totally recognise the concern around it.
Okay, so Assistant Commissioner, the police officers have to make split-second decisions, and obviously they've come in for some criticisms on this. Do you think that this could damage things going forwards? Because if there's massive amounts of criticisms on various things, do you think it will stop them making those sort of decisions again, because we all have to understand that police officers have to make a decision there and then. And then when they come into criticisms because they've had to do it, there's not an understanding by far too many that they have to do it at the last moment. Do you think that will stop them or make them more reluctant to make these decisions going forward?
I hope not. And I think what we see with our officers is that they are incredibly resilient and, you know, very focused on delivering policing fairly. They're focused on justice and ensuring, you know, and they work incredibly hard to learn. I think it's beholden on us as leaders to support our people, to recognise that, you know, the decisions you make with the benefit of hindsight and a much broader picture than when you're stood on the ground surrounded by many hundreds of people facing a complex situation. You know, we work incredibly hard to ensure that our officers on the ground have information available to them as much as we possibly can to support them in making decisions and, you know, delivering good policing across London. But also we recognise and we try to be, you know, supportive and fair when it comes to learning, you know, helping our people, you know, when we get it wrong, being really clear about where we've got it wrong, but also celebrating the great work that officers do every day as well.
Thank you, and they certainly do. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Hall. And finally, on this section of questions, Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. I'll be quite brief. First of all, Deputy Mayor, good morning. Could I ask you, do you agree that the police did an amazing job on the day, and they really gave a fabulous picture of London across the world, and that we should be very proud of the work that they did?
I think I said in my first answer to the question from the chair that I think the coronation, the policing, the coronation, and the partnership approach to it, you know, it was a magnificent event, and it was to the vast majority public. You know, the way in which it was policed ensured public safety, and we showed London off to be the amazing global city that it is, and it was a fantastic event. That does not mean that it is not appropriate to scrutinise and to hold to account the police where there are concerns around the use of some of the powers that, you know, from the Public Order Act or other powers, and the arrests that we've been discussing today. I think it's an interesting question, isn't it, around will this deter police officers from using their powers? I think scrutiny, transparency and accountability actually adds value, and there can be learnings from, you know, as the Deputy Assistant Commissioner said. That's why you review, and the Met and policing always review major events and debriefs, because there is always are always lessons to be learnt. So I think scrutiny and accountability adds value.
Yeah, no, I'm not criticising that. I think it's always good to learn lessons. I'm paraphrasing a bit, so do excuse me, Assistant Commissioner, but the Assistant Commissioner didn't say, but gave the impression that obviously on this occasion they were overcautious, that they were probably a little bit less tolerant because of the size and the ramifications of the event. I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me for that. But Deputy Mayor, did you and the Mayor agree with that approach prior to the actual event? That they should be that little bit more cautious, should be that little bit more intolerant, because the ramifications of getting it wrong were just unthinkable?
So I think your paraphrasing, sorry, apologies, is a little bit inaccurate. I don't think that the Deputy Assistant Commissioner said that they were overcautious. I think they were talking about the level of risk and what they were trying to handle, and what that policing... Yeah.
Exact wording, I'm happy to accept that.
No, it's important though, because there is value added. There's a value-laden overcautious. The phrase overcautious is value-laden. In terms of the strategic policing and the way in which we were briefed in terms of the way in which the Met were going to be policing the coronation, we were satisfied that there was a really good plan in place. It was a very difficult and complex operation. We were briefed about, you know, Assistant Commissioner's already talked about the fact that there was no plan B in terms of an alternative route. It had to go along that route, the carriage, with the King and the Queen. So there was significant risk involved. In terms of, as I said before, in terms of the use of individual powers and the use and the individual arrests, of course, we were not. That was not part of our discussions, because that was yet to take place, and those are individual operational decisions that took place on the day. And we will find out whether they were proportionate and whether they were appropriate.
But but overall, you agreed with the Met's approach to the event.
Yeah, we were briefed. We were briefed around the Met's approach, and with the risk that was attached to it, it seemed a proportionate approach. Of course, what happened on the day is where the focus is in terms of the use of the powers, and we are yet to find out whether that was proportionate.
Okay, thank you. Assistant Commissioner, if someone is refusing to give their name and cooperate with police, is that not obstructing an officer in their line of duty? You obviously know the law better than me. I hope so.
I think that would very much depend on the circumstances, and I think, you know, one of the huge strengths of policing in England and Wales is the discretion that are afforded officers. Officers have significant powers, but they are also afforded discretion, and officers seek to, you know, police with consent of our communities. So any use of powers is, you know, something that we take incredibly seriously. So I would not expect officers to leap to suggesting that refusal to provide name and address might, you know, but it could constitute an obstruction. And there are circumstances where if someone is found committing an offence and refuses to provide their name and address, then there are further powers of arrest. So it's a hard question to answer without a specific scenario, but we work incredibly hard to support our officers and train them around the use of their powers.
Thank you. Well, that just leaves me to believe that I would have supported the police officer in his actions when arresting the person that was mentioned by the chair. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Assembly Member Prince. I think I gave that as an example of behaviour that was experienced as very intimidating, but we won't continue with that, because obviously it's all under review. And you know, what is really important that we've heard this morning is the willingness to learn lessons from the review into the policing decisions at the Coronation, and I think we all look forward to seeing what you're able to share of the review as soon as that becomes shareable, because and I think I was also very relieved to hear Assistant Commissioner Rolfe saying that you are unlikely to be seeking more powers, which is reassuring in terms of trust and confidence, and that whole piece about consent in terms of Londoners understanding their right to protest as well. And I think the only other thing I wanted to say was actually, just as we bring this piece to a conclusion, it is really important to remember that some of the people arrested were not there to protest. They were there volunteering, doing a job. And so I hope that the lessons out of that piece of the review are well learned. So we now move on to our next section, which is Assembly Member Pidgeon, who is asking questions about the recent discovery of more documents relating to the Daniel Morgan inquiry.
Lovely, thank you very much. So on the 10th of May, the Met reported it found documents relevant to the Daniel Morgan independent panel at New Scotland Yard. They discovered them in January, we're told. So I wonder whether, Assistant Commissioner, you might want to explain to us how such key documents relevant to this and to the HMI report lay in a locked cupboard or safe or something for 9 years.
Thank you. As you've said, documents relevant to the Daniel Morgan independent panel and subsequent inspection by HMIC FRS were discovered by the Met in January. They were found in a locked cabinet that had not been used for a number of years on the management board floor at New Scotland Yard. And we fully acknowledge how unacceptable and deeply regrettable this situation is. And we have apologised to Daniel Morgan's family and to Baroness O'Lone, the chair of the independent panel. In terms of the timeline around this, so the Met undertook a careful assessment of the documents to consider whether any should have been disclosed, and we've identified an amount of that material we have, of course, shared with the independent panel and the HMIC FRS. So I think there are a total of 95 pages of material in 37 documents that we've initially identified that would have been disclosed under a protocol agreed with the panel, and a further 71 pages or 23 documents that would have been provided to HMIC FRS as part of their subsequent inspection. I think important to say, though, that our assessment is that there are no evidential documents that relate to criminal investigations into murder within that cabinet or within the documents found.
But what I don't understand, you only moved into the new Scotland Yard 7 years ago. So you moved a locked cabinet, not knowing what was in it. You know, I know what it's like. We've moved City Hall. I've moved the old town hall when I was a councillor. Every cabinet, everything, you have to go through. You have to digitise stuff these days. How on earth did you move a locked cupboard from one office block to another? It makes no sense.
We're obviously looking at how this has happened and why we have undertaken a full review with our records management team of all documentation stored at New Scotland Yard, or we're in the process of undertaking that. I've seen the records team themselves working their way through every cabinet on our floor and working through that. And I think HMIC FRS identified themselves recommendations for us in terms of the management of and the administration of material and information. So we are, we take those recommendations very seriously. We are working through them. But as I said, this is unacceptable and deeply regrettable.
But when you've just moved building, you wouldn't just move a locked cabinet. You would have had a big plan, you'd have had a huge team working on moving from the old New Scotland Yard to the new one. Nobody just moves a locked cabinet. I mean, I just don't understand how that happened, let alone that once you're in there, nobody thought, we can't open this cabinet, we need to check what's in it, because you're setting up a new office. How can it have just sat there in the corner on the management floor?
I'm sorry, I can't give an explanation for that at this time. I just
find it really, really bizarre, I have to say. Deputy Mayor, can I just come to you? When were you and the Mayor first informed of this? Because clearly this was discovered in January, but it only became public in May. When were you informed of this, and what did you then do?
So I was informed on the 24th of April about the discovery of these documents. The Chief Executive, Diana Lutchford, has wrote to Barbara Gray asking for answers to the questions, and a plan was put in place in terms of ensuring that the family were told, and then it was publicly communicated. There's clearly a lot of questions that need to be answered, and as already been, as we already know, there are significant questions, and there's the HMIC FRS report around the Met's handling of evidence and documents. This is part of a wider issue within the Metropolitan Police, which is being addressed in terms of really making sure that evidence, documents is properly gripped, handled and tracked and catalogued properly, because it is, I totally understand, if everybody's just how do you have a locked cabinet on the 7th floor that nobody knows what's in it is extraordinary.
And does it worry you, though, that you were not informed until the 24th of April when this was discovered in January?
Yes, it did worry me, and I did flag that as an issue, that it had taken so long for MOPAC to be informed, yes.
Because the whole new relationship you've got with the new leadership of the Met is based on trust, and yet it took 3 to 4 months before you were informed.
So it is it did concern me, and I have flagged that as an issue.
Okay, and when were the Morgan family actually informed? Because I've read that they only found out about it through the media. Perhaps, Assistant Commissioner, you can help there.
So I understand that Assistant Commissioner Barbara Gray wrote to the family of Daniel Morgan and Baroness O'Lone on Tuesday the 9th of May.
So the Mayor and Deputy Mayor were told on the 24th of April. It then took to the 9th of May for you to write to them. And of course, the 10th of May, it's all over the press. So the press presumably already knew about it on the 9th. Why did it take so long?
So my understanding is when documents, and this is in the context of previous disclosure to the independent panel, involved over 1 million pages of documentation. And of course, the significance of these documents would not have been immediately apparent when they were discovered in January. And I think initial work was to work through the significance of the documents, to work out and establish if they met the criteria for disclosure and sharing, because there were agreed protocols around the disclosure and sharing, and also to work through the criteria for sharing with HMIC FRS. At the point that the relevance was identified, I think there was an effort to give key partners like MOPAC time to consider the gravity of the information before informing and sharing that information further. Now, of course, that long time delay between January and April, May is regrettable, and I appreciate the impact that might have had on trust. But in the context of the huge amount of material already shared, I think there was work with, in good faith, work to understand what is the nature of this information and how do we share it in the most appropriate way.
Yeah. But the whole Daniel Morgan independent panel report is all about trust, and every step of the way on this particular case, the Met has just let the family down, really, and it's a deeply troubling read. Has the Met now addressed all of the recommendations made by the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel Inquiry and obviously the subsequent HMI report? Can you give us a flavour of what's changed?
Of course, thank you. So we have made substantial progress on implementing the recommendations and wider learning from in the inspections. So establishing relationships between our Directorate of Professional Standards and organisations, external scrutiny embedded in our review of legacy cases, and reviewed and revised how things like business interests, gifts and hospitality, declarable associations are managed with new policies, revised processes and better risk management in place. Over 1,800 or 18,000 one-to-one conversations between officers and their supervisors to ensure that roles and responsibilities around professional standards are understood. New professional standards review meetings on BCUs which focus on officers and staff standards and counter-corruption issues. And significant improvement on things like device management, record keeping of digital devices, so mobile phones, body-worn videos, radios, and supported by the rollout of smartphones to frontline officers, a new tasking process to proactively focus on counter-corruption priorities in our Directorate of Professional Standards, and our new counter-corruption strategic assessment and action plan, and vetting reviews, of course, as well, the Opper-Shaw process, new process for identify concerns and information regarding to officers and staff where there is a concern identified. So there are a number of recommendations that are not yet completed. So 4 recommendations that are on track for implementation by the HMIC's deadlines of October and December this year. Pre-employment checks to verify employment history over the previous 5 years and verify an applicant's qualifications. The automation of enhanced vetting for staff within certain posts. The completion of the Police National Database data wash for all officers and staff. And a prejudicial and improper behaviour flag introduced by the Met, which we're awaiting some national guidance on updating the National Professional Standards IT system. And there are 4 recommendations that are substantially progressed but will be implemented after HMIC's deadline. So ensuring sufficient property and exhibit storage with the associated security. Now, a lot of progress has been made on that, and you'll note that Baroness Casey identified issues around property and exhibit storage too, so we take that incredibly seriously. It's a significant part of our turnaround activity in the Met. The introduction of a new annual integrity health check for officers and staff, full lawful business monitoring of our Met IT systems, and automated IC system that allows categorisation of corruption intelligence in accordance with national definitions. So you'll know there are a significant number of recommendations within the Daniel Morgan report and also that by HMIC, but we are very closely tracking, and Assistant Commissioner Barbara Gray, it's a very important part of her role, and she is closely tracking that work, and it's a key part of the work that we're doing in terms of reforming the Met.
Well, the counter-corruption stuff sounds excellent, and you sound like you're making real progress there, but clearly there are issues with property and exhibits. The idea of documents in a cabinet is part of that, but also only in the news last week, horrendous case of Mia Janin, who tragically took her life, and the Met have lost key evidence, her mobile phone, the SIM card from it, and so on, which was being looked at in terms of potential bullying that led to her taking her life. Surely that worries you. These are live cases, not just our historic case here, which has never been resolved, and you've still got evidence going missing.
So that's awful to hear of that case, and yes, we take this incredibly seriously. We have already made inroads into recommendations, but also the issues identified by Baroness Casey in terms of, immediately the purchase of new freezers and equipment are rolled out across the Met, but we're also looking at things that we can do to ensure that not only do we enforce the rules around the way that evidence and property is stored effectively, but we put in place better systems for our people. So we found the implementation of the Connect property system has landed well with officers and staff, but also we're looking at things like Amazon-style lockers and piloting those on a number of BCUs where we can, because one of the things we've identified is sometimes the location of our stores may not be conducive to where officers are dealing with detainees, and ensuring that we can make this as easy as possible for all officers to do the right thing and follow the rules, and providing the facilities there for them at their fingertips to ensure that we do the right thing, but also working with our property teams around, ensuring. And HMIC have not only inspected us, they return for field work and take another look, and we've taken their recommendations very seriously, and we're very determined to improve our work here.
Deputy Mayor, back in May 2022, you told us that MOPAC would be doing a deep dive later in the year to see what progress there has been. Has that taken place, and how are you keeping an eye on this, particularly, obviously there's a huge counter-corruption side, but this huge issue which came out in HMI's report and the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel report around property and exhibits, and particularly given this recent news around these extra papers around Daniel Morgan?
I think there's, in terms of what we are in MOPAC doing around this, there's quite a lot of transparency and accountability around progress around Daniel Morgan and the HMIC FRS, which is not just from MOPAC, but there's the Met themselves have published progress on the Daniel Morgan Independent Panel recommendations. They published it in March 2022, and of course HMIC FRS published their own assessment of where the Met were in terms of the recommendations, and the Assistant Commissioner's already gone through that. We haven't yet completed a deep dive around this. What we are doing is we are, as part of the turnaround plan, there is the Deputy Commissioner has put together a long list of all the recommendations from all the types, different inspections, reports, reviews, IOPC, MOPAC, HMIC FRS. What we are putting in place is an assurance process around that, around the progress and tracking that. That's part of the work that we're doing around performance management assurance and assurance around the turnaround plan, but we haven't yet done that deep dive.
So when would you expect it to take place? Obviously it's going to be part of this assurance process.
I'll have to come back to you on that.
Because you expect it to be last year, so a year later it's not any...
I'll have to come back to you.
Okay, and it would be useful actually if we were able to have sight of that and your work programme.
Sure.
I think that would be very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Lovely, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Pigeon. Assemblymember Moama.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. This is a quick question for Assistant Commissioner Rolfe. Yes. You said one of the things that you're doing is an annual integrity health check. Can you just explain what that is? And just in light of, we will come to Casey at future sessions, but given that there were concerns within that report about the Professional Standards Directorate, how was that going to be conducted, who by, and how do both your officers, your staff and Londoners have faith that people are being treated equally in that, either for good or for ill?
Thank you for your question. I think so. I don't have the full details of how the integrity health check will be carried out, so I can commit to sharing that information with you. But my understanding is that this would be at a local level with line managers, but that we would, of course, and with our work in reforming the Met and delivering on our commitment to more trust, less crime, high standards, and renewing policing by consent. This is a key pillar of that work. Really important to us that we support our officers and staff. And where other forces have done this, it often involves a conversation annually as part of the annual career review chat, a performance development review, a conversation about, and a reminder, because often what we found is that officers are often, will reveal things that might be a vetting vulnerability that we can work through and support them with if they're asked and prompted to do so. And often, people can find themselves in a more difficult situation if these things come out subsequently. So this works well in other forces where it's a very sort of personal conversation with a line manager, asking and then supporting officers if they, for example, want, need to declare a declarable association or a change in circumstances that should be appropriately disclosed, but also supporting line managers to do that in an appropriate and supportive way. But it will not be the only answer, and it needs to be a suite of measures that also looks at our renewal of vetting processes, the way that we are professionalising our approach to professional standards at a local level. Baroness Casey identified, in fact, there's sort of some of the strengths in our local approach to that, and we are currently looking at how with our central team, we professionalise the delivery of that work locally as well. So there's an awful lot to do in that space, and ensuring that it's delivered fairly, that we are alive to any bias, and that we are actively addressing any discrimination in our processes is a key part of that work.
Okay. And so, from looking at, not moving away from what Assemblymember Pigeon has been talking about in great detail, she knows a lot about the Daniel Morgan inquiry over the years. But I just wonder how, just given that within the context of Casey at least, the frontline policing has been basically cut to the bone when it comes to comparing that kind of strand of policing with the other kind of parliamentary and diplomatic command, TSG and so on. I guess when I say frontline, I mean people like BCUs, the officers that your average person sees on the street. And what additional support financially will they receive to do that? And will borough commanders have the autonomy to actually adjust that integrity check to their local officer corps and their staff, and take into account kind of the local population? Because a one-size-fits-all imposed centrally isn't necessarily, well, it's not going to work, but there are some places where the levels of trust are better than others, I would say, and more work and therefore more support, financial but also people-wise, is needed in those places, and what's going to be put in place to make sure that's in place.
Thank you. There's a huge amount actually, and what you've described is at the heart of our approach to reforming and delivering the Met that London deserves, and supporting our BCU commanders in local policing to have the right and sufficient resources available to them. So there are a number of things we're doing at the moment in terms of how we rebalance where resources are across the Met, recognising that Baroness Casey's findings, that what she described as those central specialist teams being relatively well resourced in comparison with officers working closest to communities, having the least resources, equipment, support and least numbers. We're trying to turn that on its head and reverse it. One, with our investment in neighbourhood policing, but also looking at where we carry the gaps within our organisation. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment at a sort of corporate level with our HR teams about how we might, expect a greater tolerance in some of those central specialist teams of having vacancies and gaps, but also working, across with my colleagues in Met Operations, the way that we abstract officers to things like football policing or to central events and operations, looking at using a greater proportion of officers who are not in those frontline roles and protecting some key roles. And I'm a great believer that actually neighbourhood officers can carry out great roles around protest liaison and working closely with communities when it comes to things like protests. So I wouldn't say that we'll never use them, but I also think we need to think about, and we need to support our BCU commanders to sort of balance the resources they have available to them around neighbourhood policing, building those really strong, trusted relationships with communities to prevent crime, to address and tackle local crime and disorder and community concerns, and build trust, and balance that with our responding to emergency calls, investigating crime really, really well, and being really proactive in preventing crime and targeting our most sort of concerning offenders, and then public protection, which is a really important part of what we do. So we expect an awful lot of our BCU commanders, and I think we recognise, and I'm determined in frontline policing, that we will support them more, to have more at their disposal to do the right things. And when it comes to this work around integrity of our workforce, we need to be consistent from the centre, but provide support to enable people to, do things that work for their local community, because fundamentally we want to rebuild trust with Londoners and ensure that Londoners have influence, and the more that we can involve you in scrutiny of our decisions. So I know that not only our Central Directorate of Professional Standards are building more scrutiny into their processes and decision making, involving Londoners in a sort of process of scrutiny of key case decision making, but also we want to replicate that locally, which I think will get to the heart of the point you raise. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Moama. We are now moving on to our next section. We need to keep a bit of a shift on because we're slightly running over. And the next section is on the policing of football and is going to be started by Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Assistant Commissioner Rolfe, how is the Met responding to the key trends in football-related crime in London for the 2022-23 season, please? Albeit it's coming to it's actually ended.
Thank you.
So perhaps
so we have a central football unit who are part of our public order planning team with 17 dedicated football officers led by 2 sergeants and 1 inspector, and we have a pool of around 160 operational football officers across the Met who are all assigned to clubs but also support the Wembley fixtures, and we plan to respond to around or deal with and support around 750 games a season. Many of those, of course, sort of local games affecting clubs in London, but some of them, as you'll see, FA Cup final, national, or even international fixtures that we in London will police. And we have seen some concerning trends of late. Particularly, we're seeing a number of sort of, an increase in disorder, an increase in arrests at games, and we are seeing an increase in things like drug use and hate crime associated with football fixtures, and those are presenting us challenges. We work really closely in partnership with local authorities across London and also with the clubs, but football is a significant issue for us to police, and I think that the challenge for us is often that the officers that so for example, this last weekend with Cup final at Wembley, I think more than 30 police support units, so around 500 officers deployed to support that. And those are officers taken away from policing communities in London, and the recompense we receive from that is between 2 and 5% of our costs. So it's not feasible for us to replace those officers with others on overtime to police communities. We have to sort of weather those costs, which is quite difficult, but So some challenges, but we're working really proactively in terms of increasing the use of legislation around banning orders, gathering intelligence about those who might be intent to commit crime or disorder at football games, and so working really hard to understand. But Adi, I don't know if you want to come in, as this is your area of expertise.
So just to add to what my colleague has said is yes, it is right that the level of violence post pandemic is increasing really, and you can include hate crime in that as well. It's safe to say that we police around 4,000 events, of which football forms 750 sort of games within that. But post-pandemic, we see crowd dynamics is changing significantly. So the level of compliance is different to pre-pandemic levels. So we had quite compliant crowds prior. This is not just a London feature. This is a picture that cuts across the country. So we are all having conversations around that and what we're seeing in that space. I suppose what's a real point is if you are getting increased levels of violence, that is upping your risk levels, really. And then what that means is that you have to deploy certain tactics. And so the increased level of violence, increased level of concerns actually equates to, more often than not, more officers in that space. Now, where do those officers come from? Really, those officers come from neighbourhood policing. So we are, for want of a better phrase, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And as my colleague said as well, most importantly, is that actually the money we get back for policing football is rather negligible in comparison to what we actually put in. So it's a growing problem for us in London, but actually it's mirrored in other places across the country. So some other places do a little bit better than we do. In terms of cost recovery, so we are working on that as part of the game as well.
That raises two questions really, one about cost recovery and two about compliance. If we start first with the cost recovery, I can deal with the Deputy Assistant Commissioner if that's all right with you, but if you've got anything to add, please jump in. So do you think that there should be a levy or some kind of cost on at least the Premier League clubs, who I would suggest are the areas where you need to provide the most resources?
So what I would say is, and I'd rather sort of go into a debate on what I think what I would say is that we are engaged with the FA, we're engaged with Premier League clubs in London. What I won't want to undo is undo those conversations that already started at the moment. So we're actively engaging with them to try and redress this. This is also, like I said, it's a national problem, so our MPCC lead is also involved in some of those conversations across the piece. So what we're trying to seek is a consistent approach across the board, not just a London approach as well.
Yeah. But of course here in London we have Wembley, the home of football, and of course that's unique to us, and invariably I'm sure when there's an event at Wembley, that does require a lot of resource.
It does, but and this is another. You take me into another area of policing as well. So that could be considered part of policing a capital city. So you are talking about a slightly different.
We don't get the right wedge for that either, do we?
I wouldn't want to go into it. So it is complex, is what I'm trying to say. So we're exploring all avenues in this space to try and make sure that the recompense that we think is due to us is.
But you're having conversations.
We're actively engaged.
Brilliant.
In those
okay, that's fantastic. So the other point you raised, which I'm intrigued by, was the fact that you believe that there is less compliance now. Could you just enlarge upon that, and then perhaps if you might have a stab at why that may be? Is there have you any ideas?
So I think it's a trend that we've seen. So we've mapped this across a number of events in the last couple of years, really, post, and that's what. And this is not just police saying this. This is, if you speak to the stewarding companies, they will probably tell you the same. If you speak to partners that are involved in managing events, they will say that as well. I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to why. Some of that may well be that we spent a lot of time behind closed doors for a considerable period of time, and people are and that sounds like a rather flippant remark, but it isn't. But people are now in a space where they are trying to enjoy their freedom. But the other thing to say is that actually it could be for a variety of reasons that we've forgotten the rules of the game and are going back to old ways. I don't know. There's a whole host of things that could form.
No, it's funny that, because your first gut feeling was mine as well. The fact that people were locked up literally, and now they're just letting off steam a bit more, maybe. Well, thank goodness that the final today is not at Wembley, and so we won't have to bear the cost of that. But hopefully West Ham will be victorious nonetheless.
So I can't comment on that, but what I would say is there's a policing plan that was overseeing that.
Yeah, thank you. But the serious point on that actually is, of course, there will be a lot of people celebrating, or certainly out in the pubs tonight, watching the match, and I'm sure you have a plan for that. But can we have your reassurance on that?
Absolutely, we certainly do. As I speak, there is a commander in the specialist operations room, and there's a certain amount of policing asset that will oversee that. So across the day, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move on to Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. You've answered a couple of my questions. So for colleagues that are following this, I'm going down to B. What impact do these abstractions have on the basic command units?
We do our very best to mitigate that impact by ensuring that we don't train everybody on a certain team to be, public order trained and trained to support football matches. We use special constables and volunteers where we can as well, and Met Operations have been working incredibly hard to warn for aid deployments more officers who work in non-frontline roles and spread that impact. But just this last weekend alone, 72 in total police support units across London for not just the football at Wembley, but also the significant number of events, and that didn't include those events like the Beyonce concert in Tottenham that was managed by the local BCU. So from a local BCU policing perspective, they will always look to ensure that they manage resources well, that they have their rostering right, that they, for events like the Coronation, we'll take steps well in advance to limit the amount of leave people can take. But these things all have an impact, don't they, on officers, and particularly, we've cancelled a lot of leave in the run-up to a busy summer, and so officers will, already have, had an impact on their time away with family and their ability to sort of rest and recuperate. But we try and be really alive to that, to plan ahead, to spread the impact of those resources, and to protect those teams like neighbourhood teams, public protection investigation teams as far as possible, whilst also balancing this with our huge efforts to improve against HMIC recommendations around responding to emergencies and calls for service. So it's a sort of finely balanced approach, and we're working really hard across the Met to mitigate the impact, because we want to build those stronger relationships with communities and deliver the best service we can locally.
I'm very concerned about abstractions in general. I went to a meeting in Wandsworth Ward, Wandsworth Common Ward last week, and the officers were saying they were being abstracted for not only the Coronation but various other things, and even to go into response vehicles. So neighbourhood policing is really getting hammered, because it seems that neighbourhood police are going into everything else. I've spoken to David Bannister there, who's just in there. I was impressed by him, but if they are constantly abstracted, there's going to be more and more issues on the street, which isn't going to help trust and confidence in any which way. What would you say that the attendance in the women's matches and non-league football, are they having such an impact on our police numbers?
So we see a different profile according to different events, and whilst the women's football matches, we've not seen the disorder that we might have seen at other more high-profile matches or higher risk-assessed games, what we are seeing is that the increased popularity of those games, which is a wonderful thing, but that does mean an increased sort of requirement to assess the risk and to provide policing resources as appropriate. But we do our very best to work with clubs to understand the risk. And in terms of your point about abstractions, I share your concern, and our work to deliver the strongest ever neighbourhood policing, our growth in PCSO numbers, which I hope you saw, some of the campaign that started this week, where we're working incredibly hard to attract and recruit 500 additional police and community support officers who will be, the bedrock of our neighbourhood policing model, but also to recruit additional dedicated ward officers to build on the basic commitment we have of 2 DWOs per ward and 1 PCSO. In many wards we have many more than that, but also to, where we can, protect those resources from abstractions around ensuring that other officers are appropriately trained. And there have been a whole host of things we've been doing in the short term to address that. Of course, the Coronation weekend, with 11,500 officers deployed into central London, there won't be a corner of the Met that didn't feel the impact of that. But we are working really hard through the summer to ensure that our neighbourhood teams are based locally and working with communities, because we know that this is the foundation of our policing, and it's how we will build trust and renew policing by consent.
Yep. Data from the Mayor's Question Time 21-22 said that it cost £3.2 million to police all Premier League games that took place in London. Does that sort of sound an amount that would be right to you?
So I'll probably have to come back to you around the specific figure, but I can tell you that but for policing Wembley on Saturday, it was in the region of £300,000, roughly that. And then if you then think about how much we get back, I think we say it's around roughly probably about 2%. There's a significant amount of money that we probably won't recover in that space. So that is significant. I can also tell you that on for the FA Cup, on the Saturday itself, we deployed 1,222 officers to the Wembley footprint, and that was just for the Wembley footprint alone. If you overlay that with the review, Truman Colour review, you overlay that with Beyonce at Wembley, I think it was Brockwell Park with 30,000 people, and a whole host of other events. And those are just centrally monitored events, if you see what I'm saying. Yeah. And then you then think about the local events as well. So what I will say, though, to reassure you, that London is well versed at managing multiple events, and not every event requires a policing presence. And that's why I say, going back to my question or my answer in relation to the Coronation, we assess every event for threat, risk and harm, and we police appropriately. So there are some significant events where there are thousands of people that require next to no police officers. The other thing I would say in here is about roles and responsibilities of partners in the event space as well. So the safety and security for particular events, public safety, is actually sometimes devolves to a partner's responsibility as opposed to policing responsibility. So there's a whole complex piece in here. But let's say we make sure we risk assess appropriately, so that we are not disproportionately policing events that we should not be policing.
Okay, if you look at risk and police it accordingly, or in some instances you can actually stop fans attending football matches, as an example. If you then look at the situation, we've got level of compliance have changed, which is worrying, an increased amount of disorder. If you look at Notting Hill Carnival, the costs there to the police were £12 million. This is in 2022, 209 arrests, including stabbings and a murder, not to mention police getting injured, which is very concerning. If you held that to the same standards as football, would you not stop people going to that? If there was a football match that required so many police, that had so many arrests, that included stabbings and murders and harm to police officers, if that was reflected in a football match, would you allow the fans to still go there?
We all recognise the real cultural essence of Notting Hill Carnival. Really. So that's the first thing I would say there. I would go back to the statement I made around assessing risk and making sure that roles and responsibilities are clear to mitigate risk. The planning for Notting Hill Carnival almost starts to take place immediately after the first one.
I know, I've been involved with Unmesh.
Absolutely. So it takes place after that. I think my job, our role as a service, is to deliver our core policing responsibilities. I do want to get into what should and shouldn't take place. I think we assess each event on its merits and deploy policing resources to our core responsibilities as appropriate.
I totally understand what you're saying, and I understand the complexities around it. I'm merely saying, if you were stuck with the same situation in a football match, would you allow the fans to go if you knew your own officers were going to get hurt? I
think this is a hypothetical situation, Assemblymember Hall, and you've had a very clear answer from the Deputy Assistant Commissioner.
I've had the answer he's obliged to give in a way. I was just very interested that something that costs £12 million, we know we're going to get police officers hurt. I was just interested. If you link that with if it was a football match, I would suggest the fans would be stopped from going. But I will leave it there because I don't want to put the officers in a position. I'm just actually making the point. Thank you, Chair.
Are you finished with your questions, Assemblymember Hall?
I am.
You are. Thank you. In which case, I will now bring in Assemblymember Desai.
Thank you, Chair. I must find it mind-boggling, the logic of when we are talking about football and policing, and then to extend it to the policing of Notting Hill Carnival. I don't know whether something to do with mayoral selections, whatever.
Yes, anyway. But your questions.
In terms of hate crime, I think you said, Assistant Commissioner, that hate crime has gone up. Is this, are you able to tell us at this meeting whether it's in particular divisions, the Premier League, or is it sort of all across the 5 divisions in London?
I'm afraid I don't have that data here. That's something we can come back to you on.
Okay, perhaps, yeah, I feel. So I would ask about online football-related hate crime. Incidents of online football-related hate crime have risen by around 53% in England and Wales. Are you able to tell us whether we've seen the same rise in London, and how is the MAT working to help tackle discrimination and abuse on the internet as well as in the stadiums?
So I don't have the data here in terms of how the Met reflects the wider UK, but I would imagine that we would be sort of proportionate in terms of what we see here. And you'll have seen the high-profile arrest of somebody wearing a horrific shirt referencing Hillsborough at the weekend. We work incredibly hard to understand social media and what we might be seeing online in the build-up to any event, not just a football match. It will be part of the intelligence available to us, particularly if people are inciting either disorder or hatred using online platforms. Then we would be using that information to address it with a proportionate policing response, and it might form part of material used in an investigation as well. So I think, yes, of course, we want to use what we can online and in public spaces to address hate crime and hatred as much as possible.
So again, Mr. Commissioner, I understand that the Met has a specialist hate crime officer. I think you talked about 17 officers in a football-related unit. Now, this idea, I think, was first originally pioneered by the West Midlands, and I remember many months ago asking the Met to do something similar. I do know that there is a specialist hate crime officer, but what did worry me, over the last season, I've been to several London football grounds, Chelsea, Tottenham, starting off with Millwall, who are doing some very good work. They all do good work, by the way. Chelsea, Millwall, Tottenham, and a couple of other clubs, not West Ham, I must say, they didn't respond. And most of them, apart from Tottenham, were not aware of the existence of this particular specialist post. the person had already started. So that did sort of concern me slightly. I mean, it might take time to bed it and so on. I mean, I think it's a good practice anyway. So anyway, just to make you aware that my report's findings will be published sometime before the start of the next football season. There's a lot of good work going on, good partnership working as well, areas where we can obviously improve. But I think there's a need, when we do something good, and the Met is doing a lot of good work around the policing of sort of football grounds. It's important to publicise the good work that we are doing.
Thank you. That's a really useful prompt, and I will, when I return, ensure that we link the work of the hate crime officers and our specialists in hate crime with the work of the football policing unit. So thank you. I'll ensure we do that.
And I will send you the report in advance for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yes, just want to pick up. The Deputy Assistant Commissioner talked about there are ongoing discussions around cost recovery. So I want to actually ask the Deputy Mayor what representations you and the Mayor have made to Premier League football clubs about the recovery of more of the policing costs. And also, I recall that West Ham, because of the arrangement with the stadium, means that the public, we are paying, not the football club, for the policing over there. So I'm wondering, there's an extra incentive for the Mayor to try to save money in two ways. So I'm wondering what discussions you've been having.
Thanks a lot. We've discussed with the Met around what the costs of football policing. It's recently that they've come to us wanting to really look at this again. What we have said to the Met, said to colleagues, is that let us look at the evidence in terms of how much you are already cost recovering, and are you recovering as much cost as you possibly can. I think in other areas they do recover some additional costs that perhaps the Met don't, but we've asked for that evidence, also asked for more information around exactly how much it's costing, but that's in order to be able to support and help in terms of discussions with the Premier League and football clubs, because if there is more that can be recovered, it should be recovered. And also in terms of, you will know that it's case law, isn't there, in terms of what can or cannot be, where policing can or cannot be charged to football clubs. We have previously, back in 2017, written to the Premier League about this and written to the government about it. We stand ready to support again on that. So it's discussions in progress at the moment. One thing I would say, and is we've talked a lot about the costs of policing football, and quite rightly, we must make sure that we get the costs back as much as we can. The Deputy Assistant Commissioner has alluded to this as well, is that the National International Capital Cities grant is underfunded by £159 million. And, we had Manchester City playing Manchester United at Wembley. That's a national game. It's a national, and we are not properly. So it's not just about the Premier League clubs. It's also about London as a capital city holding football matches that are national matches. I also would say that I do think it's, and I know we all agree with this, and Umesh has already talked, Assembly Member Desai has already talked about this. Football clubs do also bring in a lot of good, and also do a hell of a lot of good in their local communities as well. We know that many, not just the Premier League clubs, Millwall, I've been to Millwall and seen the fantastic work that they do in the community. Tottenham do it, Arsenal do it, and we mustn't forget, actually, the football clubs also bring in and do a lot of good in the community, but we must make sure that policing in our communities don't bear the burden of some of the national matches that take place, and the burden where there is increasing crime and disorder.
No, don't disagree with any of that, but it's just so you're getting the evidence together to then be able to make the case alongside the Met Police and presumably other police across the country to try to get a bit more cost recovery here. Of course, the police's job is to police events and so on. It's just making sure, particularly in this time of huge cost pressures, that you can get back as much as you can, and I think we'd all support you with that.
Thank you. Sorry, someone. Yeah.
Chair, sorry. Because I mentioned some clubs, other clubs that I did visit. For the sake of completeness. Yeah. For the sake of completeness, I must mention Dagenham and Redbridge of the club, the Vanarama League, but also Arsenal had a very detailed response as well.
Okay, Full disclosure on list of football clubs from Assembly Member Desai there. Now, we said we were going to have a very brief comfort break, and this would be a good moment to do that. Should we say just 5 minutes? So we'll get going again at 5:02. Yeah, that's 6 minutes. So welcome back to the Police and Crime Committee for the last bit of the meeting. And the next section, which is looking at knife harm, is going to be led by Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, Chair. And I promise to try not to make this into a casework session, but a lot of my examples will be from my own constituency. So my general, I guess, opening question is whether or not you are disappointed with the upwards trend in knife violence since the pandemic. We're back to pre-pandemic levels, I think. I might be wrong in that, but maybe if we start with the Assistant Commissioner and Deputy Assistant Commissioner.
Thank you. So we have seen an upward trend in violence since the pandemic, and we've been looking at and doing our best to understand what's behind those incidents. We've been working closely with partners, and this requires a multi-agency response across all communities, which I know you know, and I know your commitment to this work. And we are, determined to focus on, as many things as we possibly can. So that's, including focusing on businesses selling knives, working with education, working with both public and private sector and charities to try and deliver long-term lasting change. I think what we're seeing in terms of that upward trend, so we're seeing an increase in robbery, which we're very focused on at the moment, and that sort of increase in robbery and knife crime we don't know if there's a causal link, but there's certainly a correlation in that increase at the moment. So we're digging into that. So we know knife crime as a whole has increased 16% through 21-22, and we're seeing an increase in this financial year. So we are seeing also that some things, like we were just talking about football and violence associated with football. Of course, when you look at our data, we know that that's showing a sort of increase in violence. It is influencing the sort of overall total as well. But there are 4 areas that we've sort of highlighted in particular for focus: one around gangs, one around drugs and drug markets, one relating to mental ill health, and another in terms of the nighttime economy. And we know that during the pandemic, the drug markets were affected, and we know that we had some real success because of the disruption of the drug markets during the pandemic. We had some opportunities to make some significant impact on drug markets in London, which we think suppressed some of the violence associated with those markets. We know that since lockdown measures and COVID pandemic has eased, that we are seeing a sort of knife crime and violence associated with those drug markets tracking back up again. We are seeing that as nighttime economy has sort of fully reopened again across London, we are seeing attendance at venues increasing and violence associated with those venues. So there were no homicides relating to nighttime economy and venues through 2020 and 2021. But we have seen since the pandemic 4 homicides associated with the nighttime economy, and we've seen a couple of shootings associated with clubs in 2023. So we're looking in detail across the sort of, what can we do? How can we effectively target gang activity, drugs? How do we work with partners around mental health and the work we do around the nighttime economy to reduce violence as well? So lots of activity ongoing, and continuing to focus on both how we prevent violent offences, how we understand when offences occur, from whether that's working with partners around serious case reviews, but also work around preventing domestic homicide, and also working really proactively. So you'll have seen some of the things in the news about our work to identify the most dangerous perpetrators and how we might proactively target individuals who we think present a risk of harm as well.
Deputy Assistant Commissioner, did you want to add anything, or?
Not at this stage, thank you.
Okay. So my obviously there will be a large element of the knife crime that is related to gangs and drugs and so on. But there is I don't know to what extent you're able to differentiate the kind of, what's the term, violence with injury. So not necessarily things that result in death, but that are also not related to those two issues. So one example I can think of is recently in my constituency, I have 3 BCUs and they're very different. They represent very different areas. There's been a noticeable increase in knife incidents among young people. In the case of one BCU, they are clear that those issues are not related to gangs or to drugs, but they are between young people. And I wonder, tracking that across London, what powers or what levers the police can pull, rather than illegal powers, to address that. I think the concern that I have, and that the 2 in this case of the 3 BCU commanders, their concerns are, it's difficult to see what they could have done even if they were aware of the incident, kind of how to preempt that. And the second thing, actually I'll leave it there with you, but just kind of move on, maybe your reflections on what the loss of some staff in BCUs, what that's meant. I was concerned when I was kind of getting feedback that those BCUs, they have lost, for example, I don't have the language necessarily, but intelligence analysts and those people that would have understood trends on the ground. Those people, through the last 13 years, they have not been replaced where they have left, or those posts have been removed. And so we're back to the same police that are policing football matches. The very frontline officers are doing everything, and there isn't anybody to actually understand where those trends are happening or how to engage properly with schools. Through the child queue thing, there is a nervousness, understandably, about schools officers, but is there a way to reform how we engage with not just young people, but with their families, and I think also those young people that are not in school? And I would say that some of these, a couple of the incidents I'm aware of did happen in a school context, though outside the school grounds.
Thank you. An awful lot of issues there. So just a few things we're currently working through. So I mentioned those sort of 4 significant drivers of violent crime, but we have identified a number of things, particularly with young people. One, for knife crime specifically, 38% of non-domestic abuse, so other stabbings involving under 25s, are involving the use of machetes, Rambo and hunting knives. And we think that we know that some legislative changes in relation to those weapons in 2022 had an effect, but the ease of obtaining them still, we think, is a driver for knife-enabled crime. And we know from our work with the Young Persons Action Group and the Violence Reduction Unit that young people can be quite influenced by what they see on social media. So we've been looking at adjusting our approach to when we find a knife, but also working with the Home Office and others around, is there more legislation, but also working with our local policing teams and people like Trading Standards to look at the availability of these weapons both online but also through local shops, and what we can do, whether that's test purchase operations using young volunteers. But I think you're right on about a local policing response to this. Through our work around strengthening public protection, we will be developing with partners a children's strategy that looks at their learning from child Q, but also how we work with young people, how we understand our best approach to supporting young people who might be at risk of being drawn into violent crime, whether there's a gang element or not. And what we can do to, work with partners like MOPAC around the diversion schemes that may be available to prevent young people being drawn into crime and violence. So there's a lot of work underway, and I share your concern. We are determined to have a fully resourced and capable local policing response. So, you know, neighbourhood policing is the bedrock and should be the bedrock of our policing in the Met, to build strong, trusting relationships with communities, to begin to understand their community and to work with young people in particular to, you know, influence them and their life choices appropriately. And our work with schools is really important. I see brilliant work happening across the Met by schools officers, but also by neighbourhood teams, you know, and teams like the Territorial Support Group, who will go out and spend a lot of time engaging with young people and talking about, but also the brilliant charities across London and youth groups who do this work. But I think our challenge will be in many of these places the absence of opportunities for diversion, or the retraction of services that might previously have been there around dedicated youth provision. And whilst we want to push more into that space, we would like others. And you know, a key part of our work around neighbourhood policing is we're expecting those new dedicated borough superintendents to build strong relationships with directors of children's services, with local authority chief executives, and look at how we can, you know, get more, you know, better outcomes by working together locally and doing lots of place-based work in this space.
Can I just put some of this into context? Because I know when there's stabbings or injuries, especially amongst young people, it's really, really concerning. And you know, when you see the incidents, you think, gosh, that it has to be on the increase. Is this a spike? And those are certainly questions that we always ask and we always discuss with the Met. I just wanted to put a little bit of context, because I don't mean this in a complacent way, but actually in London we are bucking the national trend on violence and on homicides. I mean, whilst we are seeing it slightly tick up at the moment, and that's no comfort if your son, or particularly son or daughter or family member has been stabbed, or you've lost a family member. I know it's no comfort. But if you look at the figures, knife crime with injury under 25, in April 2017 the total offences were 2,065. April 2023 it's 1,336. So the change is minus 35%. So, just to put it into context, it is, a change from the previous year. Yes, it's gone up 7%, but it is actually still on the downward trend. We're still, if you put it into context, we can still see that there are, we are bucking the national trend on this. It doesn't mean that we're not absolutely focusing on violence with the Met, through the Violence Reduction Unit, through the investment from the Mayor and all those diversionary activities. I just wanted to put it a little bit into context.
Yeah, no, I absolutely take your point, and I probably should have had a little bit more of a preamble. So I know that, for example, the increase in Hackney is about 2%, so it's not huge. However, it is very small, but at the same time, I think my point is there are some places where those increases are above the average, and so there are acute incidents of, if you like, cumulative is the wrong word, because I don't want to be alarmist as well. I do take your point, but where incidents happen and then they sort of build in a particular neighbourhood, the activities or the people to kind of identify those issues in the first place are not necessarily available to frontline officers anymore in the way that they were in the past. Partly, yeah. I'm surmising because of the cuts that the police have had to make to their budgets over the years, and I think obviously the 500 PCSOs coming on stream will be really, really welcome. But it's just it's hard to kind of marry up what the officers on the ground are dealing with necessarily, it's taking a while to filter to filter through.
And you are absolutely right about the issue, and it was in Baroness Casey's report, and you've already talked about it in terms of the frontline BCU being not having the resources in it that other specialist areas of the Met have had, and that being partly about austerity but also about decisions that have been taken, and Baroness Casey's report's really clear about that, and that does include the crime analysts that were, because of austerity, were taken out of the boroughs, taken out of the BCUs, and that has had of course that has an impact. One of the things I think in terms of the spike of where you get really, really especially if you live there, where you get an incident and you fear of reprisals or fear of it escalating, that is really worrying, and whatever the context of the stats, it doesn't give you any comfort. But one of the things the Violence Reduction Unit has done, and I think it's a fantastic piece of work and fantastic, really focused investment, is that where there are those incidents, the really serious violent incidents locally, they can put some really quick time funding in for there to be a rapid response, and whether that rapid response is with the police or with the boroughs or the partnership or whatever, there is that rapid response going in, and that can mean, for example, you talked about gangs, that can mean paying for some gang workers to go out and try to really understand what's happening and really try to make sure that the violence doesn't escalate.
Okay. Thank you for that. I also wanted to just maybe get your thoughts on this, since it's both for the Met and for the Deputy Mayor. Excuse me. The fact that black Londoners are disproportionately overrepresented among both the victims and the perpetrators of knife violence. And so I just want to understand how victims and victims' families are supported, and the kind of suppression activity that takes place in order to target knife crime. So I take your point about, for example, TSG and others doing good work, but within particularly, well, not particularly, but in my constituency, for example, it applies to other places as well, those black Londoners who there is a particular response to TSG, which is not necessarily shared by everybody in the community, I will say. And so the intervention itself, in the way it's done, can be an issue and can escalate things as much as it can suppress a situation. There was an incident last week at Walthamstow bus station where something relatively benign happened. Officers arrived on scene and members of the and to arrest 2 people. Members of the public kind of piled in, made a bad situation worse, and that response, eventually those people that were perpetrators of crime were arrested and that was dealt with, but members of the public have a particular view of the police, and so police's work is being made more difficult, and that there is no way to kind of get across the fact that the police are going about doing their lawful business, because it came across really badly, but we understand what they were doing.
Thank you, and I think I know the incident you're talking about, and that we are looking at what we might do differently with that, but also supporting officers who are doing their best in what were clearly difficult circumstances. So I'm going to ask Addy to speak in a moment about the work he's been leading around stop and search, because I think it's really relevant to your question. But for me, I think at the heart of this is our work around the strongest ever neighbourhood policing and building strong, trusting relationships with communities, giving communities more influence over how we deliver policing services, and particularly targeting the crimes affecting those communities. So, really close relationship, good influence over the way that we tackle crime, not just the crime that we tackle, and ensuring that communities who are over-victimised have influence over the policing they receive to tackle that victimisation. So I think, at the heart of this has got to be that strong relationship, the building trust, and in a practical way, with those new dedicated borough superintendents being really influential about the wider London resources that might be called into a community to support, but in consultation with that community, so that communities are, influential in the use of whether it's a specialist team or a specialist tactic to target crime. And I think there's so much that we want to do that will get to the heart of the issues you raise. But Addy, did you want to talk about your stop and search work?
Yeah. So talk about a number of things, if I may. So there is a proactive policing review going on as part of our quest to try and deliver a better Met for London. Part of that proactive review is focusing more assets, more resources towards BCU, so that hopefully answers some of the questions around what are we doing with BCU. So some of that will happen, and happen quite imminently. There is another piece of work that is going on, that is looking at the way we conduct stop and search proactively, and that is still very much in consultation phase with communities. But what it's seeking to do is be more precise around the data it uses, so data and backed by rigorous academic study. So if you look at the academic study, it will suggest that actually if you take knives off the streets, you save lives. But it's how you do that. And one of the things we've got to get better at, and part of the work I'm leading on, is how do we engage differently? So we engage very much on a macro level. So people in panels, neighbourhood panels, IAG members, and all of those people will actually get to hear the information. But hyper-locally, how do those people get to understand? And that's the bit where so it goes to your question around, you know, how do those people that live on those streets, in those wards, get to understand the reason why we're there? Part of that is sharing data differently to how we currently do. So you can go on and drilling down to say to people, this is why we're here, and we're working on that. And hopefully in a few weeks you'll hear more about that. The other thing that we're trying to address is that quality of the encounter as well. So escalation, de-escalation. How do we train our officers differently so they understand the impact of what is a very intrusive power, a number of our intrusive powers on people. So we're looking at that as well. And when I say looking, and this is fairly imminent in terms of sort of delivery times and actually listening to what our community is saying. They say we're doing to rather than doing with, and looking at a way of addressing that. So sharing that data more hyper-locally, actually training our officers better and differently. And also, I think what is also very important is having a restorative aspect to a proactive enforcement phase. So that intervenes very early. So all of those things are some of the things, and that's sort of drawing a line from what are the issues that our community is telling us about, and what then are we going to do? And then most importantly for anything that we do, is a rigorous evaluation that sits behind that. It's really, really important, but criteria which is set at the beginning of whatever pilot. And then have a view that what makes a difference to London is having a scalable plan. So if something works, how do you scale it up? So thinking about scalability whilst you're still in the pilot phase is really important. Those are all of the things that we are thinking about, not just in this area of work, but in several different areas. It's like, right, let's test quick, let's understand it, and let's scale it up as quickly as we possibly can to make a difference.
So on that, really quickly, Chair, do you have in that study that you're putting together safeguards against disproportionality, particularly around stop and search?
So it's a very good question. We are monitoring. So this will be a pilot. We will monitor that rigorously to make sure that we capture whether this pilot is adding to, reducing, and if it is reducing disproportionality, why? We like to think that if we are more precise about data and its use, and what we will be able to do is understand slightly better than we currently do if there is proportionality or if there isn't. And that the areas that we might choose will be some where there is clearly significant disproportionality and others where there might be reduced proportionality in comparison to the others. So we are going to track that. And there's various different bits of work that are going on around disproportionality alongside partners to look at that as well.
Okay, so that is helpful. Although I wouldn't want us to get here sucked into a conversation about stop and search necessarily, but I appreciate that's part of your work on dealing with knife crime. But the fact is that I think the police do know that there is disproportionality in stop and search.
Of course we do.
It's overwhelmingly too many black Londoners are being stopped in comparison to white counterparts. So I don't feel like that's something that needs to be studied. I think it just needs to be factored in and figure out how it is to reduce that so that that policing is more effective and so people come forward, so people don't jump on the police at a bus station when they're trying to do a good thing, I think is my point around that. But if I could just ask my last question, which is just to all three of you around Operation Denali, if you could just provide a little bit more detail about it, how it's working, and whether or not the number of people involved in it, and what are the, as you said, kind of the scaling up plans for that particular plan.
Thank you. So Operation Denali involves specialist Met police teams carrying out targeted high visibility patrols and proactive activity in busy high streets and transport hubs to tackle crime in areas that are identified as high volumes of serious violence and knife carrying. So it's focused on 6 boroughs across London: Haringey, Enfield, Croydon, Lewisham, Greenwich and Newham. And since it launched in January 2022, there have been more than 1,900 arrests and 500 weapons removed from the streets. In Haringey, homicides have fallen by 40%, 49 dangerous weapons seized and 196 arrests made since Operation Denali began. It is supported by investment from the Mayor into positive opportunities for young people in disadvantaged areas and sits alongside vital work with local communities, education and diversionary programmes, and involves police officers educating young people on the danger of carrying knives through workshops in schools and youth centres. There are nearly 500 officers dedicated to youth engagement and diversion who are working in partnership with schools and local authorities to help divert those that we identify as vulnerable and at risk from violence. So lots of activity, we think lots of progress made with that work. And as the Deputy Mayor said earlier, and I should have said at the outset at the beginning, that murders in London have fallen to the lowest level since 2014, but of course, you know, any one incident is a horrific tragedy for everyone affected and for communities. And teenage murders have reduced by more than 50% compared with the previous year. So we know that there aren't any easy answers to tackling violence, and there aren't quick fixes, but this is a piece of police work that's very focused on areas that we've identified as hotspots. We want to listen to the voices of those most affected, particularly young people, those who've lost loved ones, and to work with, you know, closely with youth workers, teachers and volunteers who are tirelessly trying to create opportunities for diverting young people away from violence.
I mean, it's on paper, not just on paper. I mean, the Assistant Commissioner's read out, hasn't she, some of the outcomes that appear to be because of Operation Denali, which is fantastic, really good. What we need to know, and I'm sure this is the evaluation that the Met will be doing, is that what is it within that can be rolled out right across London, because it does seem to be very effective. The Mayor was on a visit last week to Tottenham to go out with Operation Denali officers. So it is a really good piece of proactive policing that's having a real impact on the lives of Londoners.
Thank you. I've just got a few things I wanted to pick up on what's just been said. So with Operation Denali, what's the timescale in terms of the review process so that we understand when that might get rolled out further?
So I'm not aware of the detailed timeline for review, but I can come back to you with that if I may in writing, Chair.
That would be really helpful, and I'm sure we'd be incredibly interested to sort of hear the outcomes from that, because it seems like a very, very positive project. Then I was also wanting, Deputy Assistant Commissioner, you were talking about the stop and search, sort of proactively reviewing it, which all sounds incredibly positive. And again, I just wondered, you were talking about, can this be scaled up? Is there a timeline for the review process on that?
So this hasn't started. It's the officers are still in training.
Mm-hmm.
I do beg your pardon, sorry, that's my mistake. This hasn't started yet, it will commence imminently. So in terms of scalability, we will not know for another 6 months, 3 to 6 months, whether it's scalable or not. I don't want to preempt what the evaluation would say. The evaluation is clear and it says that there is real benefit in scaling this up, then we will do. But I couldn't give you a time scale at this point.
Of course, I understand. And you also were talking about being more precise with the data in the use of stop and search. Did I get that right?
You did. I did say that.
Yeah. So what data in particular are you referring to there?
So I'm talking about being more precise in everything that we do, really, around stop and search. So being more precise in terms of how we engage and who we engage with. So I talked about the hyper-local kind of engagement, so that's being more precise. Being more precise around the training we deliver to officers, so procedural justice training and understanding the impact. That's been absolutely more precise in that space. I'm being more precise in terms of how we intervene, so procedural justice aspects of this. And then more, and most importantly, to have academic rigour that backs up a pilot, as well as being more precise. And then in terms of the data we're using, looking at data that actually relates to saving of life. So that's taking weapons off the street. So we've been more precise in that. And that's been backed up by our Strategic Insight Unit and backed up by our Chief Scientific Officer, Larry Sherman.
Great. Well, we're planning to have some kind of briefing with Larry Sherman because it'd be very good to understand more about how that thinking works, but I'm not going to take us down that rabbit hole right now. Then my final thing I wanted to pick up on this section was Assistant Commissioner, you I think said, and I wrote this down as you were speaking, I may not have got it quite right, but young people are affected by what they see online, so that's why we're looking at adjusting our approach when we find a knife. Is this referring to the sharing of images of knives on Metropolitan Police Twitter accounts?
Yes, and we're currently working through that based on some independent academic research, balancing what we get is a lot from communities and our officers about illustrating the work that we do and what we find, balancing that with what we know from research that suggests that it has an impact on young people's propensity to carry a knife or their fear of knife crime. So we are working closely with the VRU and other partners in how we adjust that and what we do.
Very, very glad to hear that. That's something I've been raising for quite a long time, and you obviously need to show the good work you're doing taking knives off the street, but not necessarily by showing very scary blades in images on Twitter. I gather Assemblymember Prince would like to come in at this point.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a small point. I'm doing a lot of work at the moment with mothers who've lost their children. The Mayor very kindly came to a gathering that I had earlier this week in relation to that, and also the location of what we call in bleed cabinets, which the bleed cabinets, but also the bleed kits. Can you tell me what the Met's doing around that? Because I'm actually meeting with one of the local officers next week, but obviously it would be good if those bleed kits could be available in every police vehicle.
Could I just establish these are the kits where there's what you need to stem bleeding if someone's been stabbed?
all the trauma assisting equipment that you need to just really keep the person alive until the blue light services turn up. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we are currently working through the process of purchasing bleed kits, and I think we're looking at personal issue. I must check I haven't confused two things in my head, because I know we're also looking at more defibrillators in our cars. I think it's defibs per car, bleed kit per officer, who operationally deployed officers on the front line. So we're currently working through the procurement and distribution of those this year imminently to officers across the Met, because we agree.
Can I ask that you do coordinate that with local groups? Otherwise we might get duplication as well, and it'd be good to engage with you on this. And again, it's nice to see that the Mayor's taken a personal interest in this issue.
Will do, thank you.
Thank you. So we now move on to our final section, which is an issue that we had a lot of people get in touch with the committee about, which was an incident that went viral on social media, showing the destruction of two dogs and the tasering of the person who was accompanying them, so this was obviously very distressing footage. I realise you may not be able to comment on everything that members of the public would like to have the answers to at this moment, but Assemblymember Hall and I have a few questions for you on this. So yes, I've been contacted by someone who specifically wanted to know whether the police were able to establish whether because this all came about after someone was apparently being attacked by these dogs, so one of the people who's contacted me wanted to find out whether the police had established whether this person who was being attacked apparently had actually sustained any injuries.
Thank you. You'll appreciate that there is an ongoing criminal proceeding relating to the dog's owners, and additionally an IOPC investigation as a result of a referral, because we recognise public concern regarding what appears distressing on footage that people have shared on social media. But in terms of what I can say, so police were called on the 7th of May this year to reports of a woman being attacked by a dog in Commercial Road. She had suffered an injury to her leg during the incident, but did not require hospital treatment.
Okay. And do you know whether the fact that the person in control of the dogs, and they were, I understand, on leads, was a vulnerable person, was taken into account in any way?
I think that will be a matter for the IOPC investigation.
Fair enough.
I think
fair enough. Absolutely.
Yes.
What about the training that police have to deal with a volatile situation like that? Are you able to tell us anything about the training that officers have?
Yes. So in terms of officers and the destruction of dogs by firearms officers, so there is authorised professional practice with the College of Policing, which provides guidance on the appropriate issue and use of firearms and less lethal options for the police, and that does cover the use of police weapons, suitable calibre weapons for the destruction of animals in certain circumstances, and that's the destruction of animals which are dangerous or are suffering unnecessarily. And so that's the firearms officers, as you appreciate, are incredibly highly trained officers who receive very frequent training and accreditation and go through a rigorous assessment process. We also have specialist officers who deal with dogs, but you'll appreciate that their training is often around the control and management of police dogs, but they frequently are called on and very frequently are used to help us in terms of addressing and dealing with dangerous dogs who we put into kenneling and seize. So I think our dog seizures so far this year have been 521, and this is a number that's been going over years. So in 2018 we seized 898 dogs that we believed were dangerous dogs or dangerously out of control, and in 2022 that number had increased to 1,159 in that year. So already in 2023 521 dogs seized by the Met.
Do you think that there's do you think there's something behind that increase in the numbers of dogs seized?
Yes. So we are also seeing an increase in offences of and so dangerous dog offences and possession of banned breed offences have been going up. They've gone up by 60%. Since 2018, and we do think this is in no small part due to the large increases in dog ownership nationally over the COVID pandemic, and I think the reports of dangerous dogs and dogs seized in London, the bulk of the offences involve dogs causing injuries to victims in public places, and a large percentage of people bitten or attacked when the dangerous dog is in the process of attacking their own pet, so that people bitten when they're trying to free their dog, or the dog directs its aggression onto them during an attack on their pet. There have been a number of really horrific near sort of fatal incidents already in 2023, one involving a 5-year-old girl who had severe facial injuries in a communal garden area in London, a 9-year-old girl who visited a friend and was mauled by a recently acquired dangerous dog breed, and a 12-year-old boy attacked by a dog in the street, and he has life-changing injuries as a result. So, this is something that we deal with routinely, and quite frightening, I think.
Frightening for everyone, for people passing by, probably for the owners of the dogs, and also for Met officers who are trying to deal with it. Is there any option for tranquilising such dogs? I mean, is that something that can be done, or rather than shooting them immediately?
So our officers are trained with, our specialist dog officers tend to use equipment that might put a sort of rigid pole with a loop that goes around a dog's neck on the end, but that won't always be effective depending on the size and power of the dog, the particular situation, whether in a small contained space or that will not always be feasible. Officers will use things like taser, can work, isn't always effective with dogs, but can be deployed as a less lethal option. So there are a number of things deployed. Tranquilizers will often be used by vets and if called to a circumstance as appropriate, but you'll appreciate when dealing with something in an emergency situation that may not be available to us.
Okay. And finally from me, before I move to Assemblymember Hall, just the demand that policing dogs in public places is placing on the Met. Is that going, is that putting more demand on the Met with that sort of increase that you've talked about in those instances?
So we have a small specialist team in our dog unit of a sergeant and 6 officers who are experts in dog legislation. And they work incredibly hard to support officers across the entirety of the Met. They will do things like transportation of seized dogs to kennels. They'll assist with the execution of warrants if we have information about dangerous dogs being kept at an address or other dog-related offences. They'll provide specialist advice for investigations and specialist evidence to court on banned breeds. They provide training to magistrates and to other officers across the UK. And we are seeing an increase in offences reported. We're seeing an increase in kennelling requirements and an increase in our sort of prosecutions and things that we pursue through the courts. But and we work really closely with, for example, local authority, dog wardens and others around how we can, and charities who support in terms of the Dogs Trust and others who support the RSPCA around the support and welfare of animals too.
Yes, and perhaps a bit of responsible pet ownership attention to from local authorities might be helpful. Assemblymember Hall, I think you had a couple of questions.
Yes, I do. So to what extent do you think criminals are using dogs as weapons? Is that increasing as well?
So that hasn't come out in our data. I know we have, and I know it's not unusual that for there to be an association with, for dogs to be purchased as a status thing by, potentially irresponsible owners, and there sometimes is correlation with other criminal activity. But we're not, a lot of the offences we are seeing are related to poor training and purchase of dogs and poor ownership overall, of the lack of responsibility around the care and training required to manage a dog that is bred to be a working or fighting animal.
Yes, if you can't answer this, don't. But I mean, I know that they were crossbreeding with the American pit bulls, etc. When I was involved far more heavily in it, I haven't been for a while. Is there an increase in different breeds that are becoming more dangerous? Because some of them, with their jaws are so strong that they can cause problems. Are you seeing an increase in different breeds that are becoming an issue?
So in terms of our own data, so the majority of dogs that we have seized and kept in long-term kennelling are large bull breeds. The XL bully in particular, we know has been responsible for 11 of the 13 fatal attacks in the UK this year.
So is there any legislation that you can use to take those dogs off the street?
I don't believe that is a banned breed at the moment, but I think I don't want to go into territory around legislation commentary again. I think I'm
just trying to be helpful because clearly, if there's an issue with a specific breed, I'm genuinely not being political here.
There's my understanding is there's a government working group at the moment around responsible dogs and a responsible dog ownership working group, and we're waiting to find out what their recommendations are. I don't know whether they've looked at legislation, but they're certainly looking at this issue around dangerous dogs, so it is being looked at nationally.
I think, if I may, Chair, I think from long experience in this work, sometimes legislation that focuses on a particular breed, we find it incredibly difficult because, as you'll see, you know, variations in breed, and often the solutions to this are much more focused on responsible ownership and owners taking on a dog when they know that they're fully able to not only care for it but to train it and commit the time required in being a responsible owner.
The trouble is so many don't understand that till they've got them. We all know that. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Just checking, no other Assembly members coming in. Excellent. That brings us to the end of this morning's session. So I'd like to very much thank all three of our guests for attending this morning, for your answers to our questions, and also for there were a few items that you promised to get back to us on. So, and I'm sure they will have been noted down, so we will be able to set those out precisely. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Excellent. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 23-24 year? And the next meeting of the committee is currently scheduled to take place on Wednesday the 21st of June at 10 o'clock in the chamber at City Hall. We are actually intending to do a site visit to the West Midlands to learn about their drug diversion work. So that formal meeting may get cancelled, but we are saying that it's happening until it gets cancelled. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.